The logic lies in the general U.S. geopolitical concern for the region. The United States has no particular concern for Israel. If Israel stopped being useful for U.S. purposes, it would go down the drain immediately. No moral concerns and no concerns for the greatest democracy in the Middle East and so on. All of that's there to justify policies taken on other grounds. People who think otherwise are going to be due for a rude surprise when U.S. policy finally does change, as it's likely to do. The concern of the United States in the region is basically oil. It was recognized since the 1940s that the Arabian Peninsula is the major source of energy, cheap, easily accessible energy for the next several generations, and that whoever controls that oil will basically dominate the world, meaning dominate, and if the United States controls it, it will have extensive power over its major enemies in the world, which are Western Europe and Japan. The Soviet Union is a rhetorical enemy, but Western Europe and Japan are real enemies because it was recognized already then, are potential rivals. By now they're quite real rivals, not potential ones anymore. And control over oil, control over their energy resources gives the United States veto power, as George Kennan put it years ago, in case they get out of line. I happen to be referring specifically to Japan, but the same is true of Europe. So the United States, which did not need the oil for itself at that time, and in fact still doesn't really, the United States and the Western Hemisphere, totally controlled by the United States, was the major oil producer, more than half the oil in the world until 1968. But the United States needed control over the oil as part of the mechanism for controlling the contours of the general global order that it intended to dominate. And that was taken very seriously. The oil of the Middle East was described by the State Department back in 1944 as a stupendous material resource and the greatest strategic prize in world history. And that characterization continues for a year after many years, and in fact still does. When the declassified documents emerge about today, 30 years from now, I don't doubt that you'll find similar comments. Now, how do you control the oil? Well, what threat is there to it? The same threat that there is to U.S. access to resources everywhere in the world. If you study U.S. foreign policy seriously, that is, you look at the actual documentary record of top-level planning, you discover a constant strain. The United States must be opposed to what are called nationalistic regimes. That means regimes that are responsive to pressures from the masses of their own population for improvement in low living standards and diversification of production and control of their own resources. Those are essentially quotes from document after document after document. Now, these regimes are what are sometimes called ultra-nationalist, or another term for them is radical nationalist. Now, radical here has nothing to do with politics. They can be ultra-right regimes run by some, military dictatorship. They're still radical nationalists if they're responsive to the need to domestic concerns, instead of being responsive to the overriding rights of U.S. investors. That's what counts. And if they don't meet that condition, they're radical regimes, or they're ultra-nationalist, or they're a threat, and they have to be overcome, either by military force or some other means. So you have to stop radical nationalism, nationalist regimes which try to carry out development for domestic needs instead of for the transcendent needs of U.S. investors. In 1958, the National Security Council, so that's the highest level of planning, produced a memorandum which stated that in the context of U.S. opposition to radical Arab nationalism, a rational policy would be support for Israel as the only reliable pro-U.S. force in the region. Now, that's the first recognition that I have been able to discover of what is now called the strategic asset thesis, the idea that Israel is a strategic asset which can serve U.S. needs. And the primary needs are to control and bar radical Arab nationalism, independent nationalist forces, which might ultimately threaten U.S. domination of the oil-producing regions. There was a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, reaching the level of actual war in the early 60s, and that was considered very dangerous because support for radical Arab nationalism in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Principates and so on, that could be dangerous to the major sources of oil, meaning they might fall under domestic control. In 1967, Israel, in fact, was regarded at the time by U.S. intelligence as a barrier to radical nationalist pressures against the Arabian Peninsula, against Saudi Arabia. Well, all of that came to a head in 1967. In 1967, Israel, with extensive U.S. backing, public U.S. backing, maybe actual more than just backing, but at least public U.S. backing, won a major military victory. It smashed the major Arab force, Egypt, also Syria, conquered the Sinai, the Syrian Golan Heights, the West Bank, expelled a couple 100,000 people, and implanted itself in this region as a kind of a regional superpower. Now, that was considered a big victory in the United States. There was a lot of applause. The reason was that, I mean, whatever the population may have felt, the reason among planners was that this broke the back of radical Arab nationalism. It terminated the radical nationalist threat to Saudi Arabia, so it was assumed. And Israel won a lot of points on that. It's at that point that the close U.S.-Israeli alliance begins. We're now getting up to 1970 and 71. What was introduced at that time was what was called the Nixon Doctrine, about 1970-71. Now, the Nixon Doctrine was based on a recognition of the reality that the United States could not police the entire world itself, just didn't have the capacity to do that anymore. And therefore, we had to have what the Secretary of Defense called local cops on the beat, local gendarmes who would run particular areas for us, with police headquarters, of course, in Washington. The way Henry Kissinger put it, in a little more academic terms, he said other powers will have regional responsibilities which they will carry out within the overall framework of order managed by the United States. So that's a kind of a derogation of authority. You've got these regional authorities there, the local cops, and they sort of run their own affairs. They run the local region, and we give them the general framework. That's the Nixon Doctrine. In the conditions of military confrontation, as long as a military conflict continues there, Israel is, in fact, very dependent entirely on the United States for its survival. The level of armaments in the region is fantastic. Anything gets out of control, they could be wiped out. To keep their military edge, they require massive support from the United States, and being dependent, they're therefore assumed to be dependable, and therefore they perform these services. Well, all of that is what's called the strategic asset theory. There are more connections than that. There are intelligence connections which are considered valuable to American intelligence. They cooperate in weapons development. They are able to try out weapons in the field, which is very valuable, particularly against defenseless targets, which is the best way to do it. There's no way directly for the Pentagon to try it out, but Israel can try out the new fancy weapon systems, which is considered, again, a big gift and so on. And they sometimes capture, advanced Russian armaments, and intelligence likes that, and so on. So lots of services and connections, and all of that put together is the strategic asset theory. Now, one could argue that this is a crazy policy. Okay, that's another question. But it's not one that lacks logic. That's what's important, and it has been the one that's dominated. As to why it's dominated, you probably have to look at the domestic American political scene and all sorts of other things, but the fact that it's dominated is a fact, and that's for our purposes here. It's enough to point that out. And for this reason, the United States has been blocking any political settlement, because a political settlement would terminate these arrangements. In a political settlement, Israel would simply be absorbed into the region as its technologically and industrially most advanced component, but instead of being a kind of a Prussia or a Sparta on call for services, it would be a kind of a Switzerland or a Luxembourg, and that's essentially no use for the purposes of serving as a regional gendarme or a global mercenary. After the Shah fell, Israel's role as a strategic asset became more important because it was the last gendarme. And in fact, U.S. aid to Israel shot up at that time, 79, 1980, around then, from 79 to 1982, U.S. aid to Israel, even official aid, you look at the whole story, it's more, but the official aid reached about 50% of total U.S. aid in the world. That's a lot for a small country, and it reflects the significance of maintaining U.S. dominance over that strategically critical region. Well, that's the logic of the U.S. opposition to a political settlement over many years, and I think it's the logic of the current rejection of a political settlement, which the U.S. is still engaged in.